This
George,
conference will now be recorded.
It's all up to you, George. George, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I could hear you fine, yes.
Okay. Tonight I'm going to tell you the story of the Boer War. It was not a big war, and it was not something from which very many people took the lessons they needed to be taking. And I hope you find it interesting tonight. First, let's talk a little bit about South Africa. South Africa actually at the time of the wars was divided up into smaller colony states, one of which was called the Cape Colony. There was the Transvaal, there was Natal, and there was the Orange Free State. In the middle of all this, Cecil Rhodes, who was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, established the state of Rhodesia, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. First, I want to talk about the settlement of South Africa because it's not what I thought it was. Actually, it was first discovered or explored by the Portuguese in 1488. And what they were doing was looking for a trade route to the Far East. The Dutch East India Company, and they used the term VOC, and I may use this interchangeably, were the first Europeans to start exploring parts of the interior, operating off of the Dutch garrison at the Cape of Good Hope in the late 18th century. So all of this was going on just as the United States were forming. Within 3 decades, the Cape became home to a large community of former employees of this VOC operation who settled there after completing their service contracts. And that's who the Boers were. However, in 1795, Great Britain decided that they wanted the Cape Colony. And their primary interest in it was to keep the French from using that area on their way to India. They were in competition with the French for Indian commerce. The Napoleonic Wars followed. They caused a lot of disturbance in the Cape. And by 1806, the entire Cape was controlled by something called the Batavian Republic. They then were occupied by the British after a battle that I did not look up called Blouberg. So there was a lot of fighting going on in this general area at the end of the 19th and the end of the 18th and early 19th century. The Dutch East India Company, Jerry got me onto this. I didn't even know they existed. They were a mega corporation founded as an amalgamation of rival Dutch trading companies. And if you didn't know it, the Dutch back in that era were very, very powerful trading economic factors in the world. In 1580, Portugal had united with Spain, and the Dutch were at war with Spain. So then the Portuguese Empire became a target for the Dutch incursions, and that motivated Dutch merchants to enter the trade of spices themselves. The VOC was established on 20 March 1602. It was a chartered company to trade with India, from which 50% of the textiles and 80% of the silk used in Europe were imported. This was 2 years after the British East India Company, and those of you who watched my program on the British Empire will remember them. 2 years after they were established, and they had a very similar purpose and a very similar structure. They did not have the military force that the British East India Company had. In addition, the company started trading with other Southeast Asian countries, because the Dutch government gave it a 20-year monopoly on the Dutch spice trade. And that's much of what was going on here in the East Indies. That's where the spice trade was coming from. There were no spices other than salt and maybe pepper available to people in Europe. All the rest of them they were getting from the East Indies and India. Now, who were the Boers? They were South Africans, and they were of Dutch, German, and Huguenot descent. They were the settlers of the Transvaal, the Orange Free State, and Natal. They were hostile towards African people. They were very willing to do whatever it took to take the land away from the natives who lived there. They were also hostile towards the government of the Cape because it was trying to control their movement and their commerce. They compared their way of life to that of the Hebrew patriarchs of the Bible. So in a sense, they were pretty similar to the Mormons. They developed patriarchal communities that were based upon a pastoralist economy.
Hey, George, did they have oh, there you're talking about Calvinists.
They were staunch Calvinists. They considered themselves the children of God in the wilderness.
George, where did the name Boers come from?
That's a good question. I can't answer that. You want me to make something up? I'll be glad to. I don't know.
Hey, George, none of us would know any better, so go ahead.
They were divinely ordained to rule the land and the backward natives. Like I said, they were fairly similar to the Mormons. By the end of the 18th century, they had severed links between themselves and their urban counterparts over in the Cape Colony. They spoke a language called Afrikaans. It had evolved from the mixture of Dutch, indigenous African, and other languages, including German, although Dutch is pretty close to German as it is. And this is what they look like in terms of their clothing. You can see that everybody's armed to the teeth.
Hey, George,
Yes.
just I did a quick look up, and Boer is means farmer in Dutch and Afrikaner.
Huh. Did not know that. Thank you, Jerry. Okay. There's something called the Great Trek. And if you look at the map, you see where these people who were living in the Cape Colony headed north and east. It took place in the early part of the 19th century. About 12,000 Boers left the Cape in this trek, and they were heading for the rural spaces in the Veld and in southern Natal. Now, British officials who were looking at that from the Cape Colony worried, but them going into southern Africa would result in conflicts between the migrants and the Bantu people who were already living there. And they were right. It did result in that. The Boers were perfectly willing to do whatever it took to get the natives out of their way. They were a warlike group of people. In 1852, the British government agreed to recognize the independence of the settlers in the Transvaal, later called the South African Republic. Granting them independence meant that they had their own government, but it did not mean that they were exclusively outside of the sphere of the British Empire. And I'm not sure I could explain what within the sphere of the British Empire meant, perhaps a little bit more than what it means today to be in the Commonwealth. For instance, they probably had a British high governor of some sort. In 1854, they recognized the independence of the Orange Free State. So in the middle of the 19th century, the people here in the Cape Colony acknowledged the fact that the people over here were independent of the colony. However, these new republics committed themselves to apartheid, which is strict segregation and discrimination. That would come back to haunt what became of this whole amalgamation of peoples. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about diamonds and gold, because that's what changed things. In 1867, the discovery of diamonds and gold in Southern Africa set the stage for the Boer War. By the end of 1871, nearly 50,000 people had moved to this little area. It was a mining camp. It was probably a lot like what we saw in the American West. It was later named Kimberley. In 1886, just to make it worse, the world's largest gold fields were discovered in the Wintersbaan, which is part of the Transvaal, which is up in here. So now you've got a huge amount of natural resources in this area that are desirable, to put it mildly. Gold especially was important at this point in time because it was needed to back national currencies. Subsequently, the British colonies, the Boer republics, and these African kingdoms, because they were still African kingdoms in amongst this, all come under some level of British control. And to understand how they administered that isn't something that I wanted to even try to get into. It was part of how the empire operated. Jerry, you had asked the question about where did the Germans come from? This was German Southwest Africa over here on the western coast above the Cape Colony. So that's where the Germans came from, who went this way. The changes that were following had two forces. First, it was the development of the mining industries. And then secondly, it was the imperialist interventions of Great Britain. That was then driving circumstances in the latter part of the 19th century in South Africa. I'm going to quickly tell you a little bit about each of these states, just so you can know the players. The Orange Free State was an independent Boer sovereign republic under British suzerainty in South Africa. And if you ask me what suzerainty means, I can only say that the Brits could establish some level of control over their politics, but not a lot.
George, where did their term Orange Free State come from? And you can make up anything you want to.
Orange is the color of Holland, right?
Well,
Isn't that the national color of Holland?
if I can
No,
Sure, Jerry, go ahead.
a Dutch ruling family was the House of Orange
Yeah, there you
in
go.
the Netherlands.
That's
So
true.
the explorer who settled in South Africa named a river, the Orange River, after the House of Orange, and then that state took the name from the river.
The Orange Free State ceased to exist after it was defeated in the Boer War. The first Boers had actually come there in the 1830s. They established their own government and they feuded with the British over the next few decades. By the 1860s, they were fairly prosperous and fairly stable. And remember in the 1860s what happened? That's when diamonds were discovered. That's where Kimberley is. Diamonds were discovered in 1870, and the Free State then had to establish a temporary government over the diamond fields that nobody was happy with. The administration of the area was satisfactory to no one. And so in 1871, and the people in the Orange Free State were willing to let this happen, it became British territory. The Transvaal is north of the Orange Free State. That's this area here. That is also where the gold mines were. The Diamond Zone was claimed by the Orange Free State, the South African Republic, and numerous other peoples. So these diamond mines and the gold mines did not have a clear ownership. Colonial Secretary and Disraeli, remember, was the English Prime Minister who was into empire, sought to unite all of these republics into a federation of the British Empire. That was him in 1874. So now the people in this area are getting political pressure, all three of these, plus I think this was one of the African states, and I can't even remember which one, to join the British Empire. Disraeli's government was trying to do that. The Transvaal, with very little resistance, this area, was proclaimed a British colony a few months later. So the Brits just stepped in and said, we're taking over. This is after gold was discovered. The Transvaal Boers decided to fight for their independence. There really weren't that many British soldiers involved, and they were defeated by the Boers in the First Boer War. By the London Convention of 1884, the Transvaal self-government was restored, again sovereign, subject to this suzerainty over external relations. And again, I couldn't begin to explain what that means. Now, Natal is along the eastern coast, the southeastern coast of Africa. The Afrikaners established the Republic of Nepal, and I can't pronounce that word. The new Boer Republic was soon unsettled by an influx of natives returning to Natal to resettle the lands that had been abandoned to the Zulus. This country, I was trying to think of, this was an African empire, Lesotho. The British also opposed the establishment of any independent state on the coast of South Africa. And so they annexed Natal. And I guess that was a fairly normal procedure of the British Empire. If they wanted something and nobody was strong enough to stand in their way, they just took it. Many of the Republic's Afrikaner inhabitants left for the Transvaal or the Orange Free State. They were replaced by new immigrants, mostly from Britain. The Natal colony was extended by acquisitions of Zulu land, and then after the British had assumed control over the Zulus in the Zulu War. So there was struggle with the natives going on throughout the latter part of the 19th century. Zulu land then was formally annexed by the British in 1887. Then they were given self-government in 1893, and what that was about, I mean, you could probably do a huge story on all of these governments changing and who was doing what and what was the reasoning for it. Wanted to talk a little bit about De Beers and Cecil Rhodes. Diamonds had been discovered in the mid-1860s on the farm of Nicholas and Diedrich De Beer near the city of Kimberley in the Transvaal. In 1871, Cecil Rhodes bought a claim to the De Beers mine, and then he brought up most of the other diamond mines in southern Africa. And I've often asked myself the question, where did he get the money? If you look to the right, you see Nathan Rothschild. He underwrote the development of De Beers. The industry became a monopoly in 1889 when his consolidated mines became the sole producer of diamonds. They produced 90% of the diamonds in the world. By the time of his death, 10 years later, they controlled 90% of the production of the world's diamonds. Rhodes then chartered something called the British South Africa Company in 1889. Their purpose was to exploit mineral wealth in that area of the world. It was given a charter by the British Crown, similar to the British East India Company. Guess who its first directors were? It was Cecil Rhodes. But they had the power to not only trade, but to govern. They had their own army, they had their own flag, and they could decide who got what land where. That was De Beers diamonds. So they were an economic powerhouse. Cecil Rhodes, and I talked a little bit about this when I talked the British Empire. I thought you might not remember it all. He was a mining magnate and politician who served as prime minister of the Cape Colony for 6 years. He was a believer in imperialism. He founded the Southern African territory of Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe and Zambia. He was the son of a vicar, went to South Africa at the age of 17, entered the diamond trade in 1871, and was obviously a very, very shrewd, ruthless person. He entered Parliament at the age of 27, and a decade later, he was Prime Minister. As I said earlier, he oversaw the formation of Rhodesia, but he was forced to resign as Prime Minister in 1896 after he prompted an attack on the Transvaal, and I'm going to talk about that attack. He believed that the Anglo-Saxon race was the first race in the world, that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. And he's the person who founded the Rhodes scholarships, although I don't know that he even knew that's what was being done with his money. He advocated vigorous settler colonialism, ultimately a reformation of the British Empire so that each component would be self-governing and represented in a single parliament in London. He died in 1902. Here's Rhodesia, another state up on top of the Transvaal. In the late 19th century, the territory north of the Transvaal was chartered to the British South Africa Company. Now, who thought they had the right to charter somebody else's territory? Had to have been the Brits, but I don't know where they got it from. His ambition was to create a zone of British commercial and political influence from the Cape to Cairo. He wanted to control all of Africa. He oversaw the formation of Rhodesia during the early 1890s, but he was forced to resign after he attacked the Transvaal, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that attack. His driving force for the annexation of the Transvaal was the belief there was a huge gold field that never materialized in Mashona land, and I'm not sure where that is. Rhodes and his pioneer column marched north in 1890. They marched to Rhodesia, and they required this huge block of territory that the company would rule until the 1920s. This pioneer column was a force, and he liked about this size of an organization of 450 men raised by Rhodes in his efforts to annex this territory I talked about before, later called Southern Rhodesia. They established order. They established order with weapons. They established order with force. And they maintained this province until the early 20th century. Now, the first Boer War, 1880 to 1881. It was called the TransFall Rebellion. It only lasted about 4 months between the United Kingdom and the Boers of the Transvaal. 3 factors had fueled their expansion into southern Africa: trades, minerals, and other European powers. And the other European powers is not to be overlooked in terms of what kind of a factor did it play in what was going on. In 1875, the British colonial secretary approached both the Orange Free State and the Transvaal Republic to organize a federation, modeled on the federation of the French and English provinces in Canada. However, the cultural and historical context differed entirely, and the Boer leaders turned him down. So what did the British do? They just annexed the Transvaal. And at the time, the Transvaal had very serious economic problems, so there was no resistance in 1877. That did not last very long. However, once the Transvaal Boers had defeated the Zulus, they were resentful of the British annexation and they decided to do something about it. They revolted on 16 December 1880. They ambushed, there were British troops by then in the Transvaal. They ambushed a British column of the 94th Foot who was returning to reinforce Pretoria. From December through January, British garrisons all over the Transvaal were besieged by Boer forces. They had no regular army. They called their groups of people commandos. And if there was ever a use of the word commando before them, I don't know where it was. When danger threatened, all the men in the district would form a militia organized into these military units. They would elect officers and they'd go and wreak havoc. Commandos were civilian militia. The men wore what they wanted to, usually dark gray, neutral colored or earth tone khaki farming clothes. And you can see they all had fairly sophisticated weaponry. Although the war was called the First Boer War, the engagements themselves were of a minor nature. There weren't very many men involved, and it was a very brief combat.
George, do you know where did they get their weapons and ammunition?
They bought them. Since time immemorial, people like Krupp, and so have there been, in fact, I have a program somewhere on the arms merchants. People will sell anybody who wants to buy it, just about anything you can imagine, including fighter airplanes, bombers. So they bought them. They bought them in Europe.
In Europe, okay. They brought to Africa.
Right. There
Well,
were
George, who controlled the gold?
Who controlled the what?
Who controlled the gold deposits?
It depended, and if you were in the Transvaal,
Yeah.
they were kind of controlled by the people who were doing the digging. Okay, so the commercial, that's what I said earlier. Part of what was driving all this was commercial instincts. The country themselves was not sophisticated enough to be able to establish order. In Transvaal, the Boers were unable to control the Transvaal gold mines, and that's how the British set up their rule there. So the British did kind of, and I won't say totally. It was they were really controlled by the Cecil Rhodes kinds of people. They had their own armies of their own forces. It was a chaotic situation.
Thank you, George.
The first Boer War only lasted, as I said, about 4 months. There were less than 1,000 casualties, and most of those were British casualties. But it was an omen of what was to come. It ended with a Boer victory and independence of the Transvaal. So here we are in 1881, and the Transvaal is back to being in Boer control. Now, there's an interim here of less than 2 decades. And in that interim, there was something called the Jameson Raid, and I'll talk about it. The Brits had a new prime minister, William Gladstone. Gladstone was not, as had been Disraeli, an imperialist. He did not want to build the mightiest empire in the whole world. So he was conciliatory towards the Boers in South Africa. They then signed a peace treaty with the Boers. They realized that any further actions were going to require more troops. The war would be costly, messy, and it would last a long time. And so in 1881, the Gladstone government signed a peace treaty with the Boers. They accepted nominal rule and British control over external relations. How that was administered, I suspect would make all of us happy that we live where we live. However, the discovery there in 1886 then made the Transvaal a political and economic threat to Britain, who was engaged in a scramble for colonies with France and Germany. So in 1896, good old Cecil Rhodes, now Prime Minister, attempted to overthrow the government of Kruger, who was president of the Transvaal. He sent a raid called the Jameson Raid from the British South Africa Company, which he was its primary director of, into the Transvaal. That raid failed, but it ignited the Second Boer War. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Jameson Raid, just in case you needed to know. In 1895, a column of 600 armed men, made up mostly of policemen, was led by Dr. Leander Jameson over the border from Bechuanaland towards Johannesburg in the Transvaal. The plan was to trigger an uprising by who they thought of as the primarily British expat workers in the gold fields before the Boer commandos could mobilize. That was the plan. However, the authorities in the Transvaal had advanced warning. They tracked this group of 600 people from the moment they crossed the border. The column was surrounded near a place called Krugersdorp. They were surrendered and were arrested by the Boers. And now it gets really interesting. The Boer government, remember this is now an independent government, handed their prisoners over to the British because the British are the ones who started it for trial. Jameson was tried in England for leading the raid, but in England, he was lionized as an anti-Boer, anti-German, and treated him as a hero. He was sentenced to 15 months imprisonment for this raid, but then he was later rewarded by being named Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. He was ultimately anointed as one of the founders of the Union of South Africa. So he was an insurrectionist who got away with it and profited from it eventually. Now, the Second Boer War, and I'm not going to go into great detail about the Second War, and it really wasn't that big a war either. I'm just going to hit some highlights, or else we'd be here all night. It was fought between the British Empire and two independent Boer states, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. A force of no more than 50,000 Boers frustrated and tied down almost 500,000 troops of the world's greatest empire. Now, does that make you remember some numbers from Vietnam? We had 500,000 American troops there, and there were about 50 to 75,000 VC when we started. And then they started bringing in more and more North Vietnamese regulars, but there was never any time when we didn't have them heavily outnumbered. Initially, the Boer attacks were successful, and then later British reinforcements reversed these. And if you read about the fighting between the Boers and the British regular troops, you would have thought that the British learned something from all of their other colonial wars, but they tried to use standard infantry tactics against guerrillas. And it was a very, very costly way to function. The Boers were well armed. They struck first. They besieged these three areas, Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking in the early 1900s. The war continued for years with guerrilla warfare. British countermeasures included the scorched earth policy, which brought the Boers to terms. I'm going to talk some about the scorched earth. British tactics changed after about the first year. For about a year, they fought, quote, a gentleman's war, but then they changed drastically. They relieved the besieged cities and they invaded the Boer republics in late 1900. The size of the army that was there, and this, now you can get back to what was the lesson. The size of their army, 400,000 men, was overwhelming. The Boers could not fight staged battles with their guerrillas. There were just not enough of them, and they were not well enough to arm. Tell you a little bit about Winston Churchill in the Boer War. Might or might not have known this. He was a British politician and army officer, and the army officer is what we're going to talk about. He joined the British Army in 1895. He saw action in India, the Anglo-Sudan War, and the Second Boer War. In the Second Boer War, he gained fame as a war correspondent, and he wrote books about his campaigns. He arrived in Natal in 1899 at the age of 25. Now, by then, he was out of the army. He was a reporter for the London Morning Post. In November, he joined an armored train reconnaissance that was headed north. Boers ambushed the train. The Boer General Gilbert decided that Churchill was too active a role in the skirmish, and he was taken to Pretoria to be imprisoned. Within 2 months, he had escaped from the prison. He stowed away on a coal train and started looking for somebody to help him. He was rescued by the owner of one of the doors that he knocked on, and he escaped. Scorched earth policy. It was initially introduced by Lord Roberts, who was the original commander of the British forces, and later expanded upon by Lord Kitchener. Here's the policy. Whenever public property is destroyed or injured, civilians will be held responsible for aiding and abetting the offenders. The houses in the vicinity of the place where the damage is done will be burnt, and the principal civil residents will be made prisoners of war. In complying with this policy, almost all of the farmers' homesteads were burned to the ground. Livestock was killed, crops were burned, and the women and children were sent to concentration camps. This is what scorched earth meant. So this is what Sherman did on his march to the sea in triplicate. On June 16th, 1915, they held something called Scorched Earth Policy Day to memorialize the policies introduced during the Second Boer War. Lord Kitchener, I thought you might want to know a little bit about the conqueror of the Boers. He was an Irish-born senior British officer. Most especially, his scorched earth policy against the Boers was how they were defeated. He was credited in 1898, before the Boer War, for winning the Battle of Omdurman in the Sudan. So he was the senior British officer in that period of time. As chief of staff in the Second Boer War, he succeeded Roberts as commander-in-chief. And by then, the Boers were using guerrilla tactics. They were not fighting in the open. He imprisoned Boer civilians in concentration camps. He went back to England, and by 1914, he was Secretary of State for War in the British cabinet. He organized the largest volunteer army that Britain ever saw up until that time. I think it was bigger by the Second World War, but I'm not sure. He oversaw a significant expansion of materials to fight on the Western Front. Kitchener was on a warship that was sunk by a mine in 1915. In our day and age, we would call him a butcher. Now, the camps. What does that remind you of? Concentration camps are usually linked to World War II and the Holocaust, but the Boer War, which was the most destructive modern conflict at that time, shaped the nation to become immune or inured to concentration camps as a way of dealing with a recalcitrant civilian population. This is where the British first used concentration camps. When the British occupied the capital of the Orange Free State, they offered the Boers an oath of neutrality, and the Boers took it. This allowed them to remain on their farms in the Orange Free State. But then they repudiated their oaths, and these burghers were placed in refugee camps. The first camp was opened in August of 1900. These concentration camps resulted in the deaths of over 4,000 women and 22,000 children in the 2 years that they were in operation. They were like Andersonville. The poor diet in the camp led to disease, diphtheria, whooping cough, dysentery, measles, and typhoid fever. They were death camps. That's not what they were intended to be, but that's what they wound up being. Cessation of hostilities. The tactics of the British, scorched earth and concentration camps, served their purpose. The Boer militia grew tired of the fighting and morale deteriorated. The British offered peace terms in March of 1902, and the Boers turned them down. 3 months later, they changed their mind. Boer leaders accepted peace conditions and signed the Treaty of the Verenigingen in May of 1902. This is interesting. The treaty ended the independence of the Transvaal, placed both territories under British Army administration, but allowed them to retain their self-government. It also called for the immediate disarmament of the burghers, with a general amnesty given to them. No death penalties were to be meted out against the defeated Boers. They were able to continue their Dutch language in the schools. The Second Boer War came to an end, and 8 years later, in 1910, South Africa was united under British dominion, and it became, and this is this entire area now, and I believe did not include Rhodesia, became the Union of South Africa. It included several Swaziland and Basutoland, which were native populations. That was all now the Union of South Africa under Jameson, who was out of prison and now Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. Now, I thought this was interesting. I don't know how many of you have ever seen the movie Breaker Morant. Show of hands is not necessary. If you haven't seen it, I want to encourage you to see it. It's a 1980 Australian war drama. It's a true story and well worth watching. It concerns the 1902 court-martial of 3 lieutenants, Harry Morant, Peter Hancock, and George Whitten. It was one of the first war crime prosecutions in British military history, and it was prosecution of Australians who were serving in the British Army during this Boer War. Morant, Hancock, and Whitten were accused of murdering captured enemy combatants. They were also accused of murdering an unarmed German minister in the North Transvaal, and part of the problem was the Germans were raising a fuss with the South Africans about this minister being killed. It's an excellent film. Among other things, its exploration of the Nuremberg defense, because all three of these lieutenants were following orders. It was also about the politics of the death penalty and the human cost of total war. As the trial unfolds, the events in question are shown by flashbacks. So you start with them in prison on trial, and then it shows you what happens. And what it shows you is they were following orders. However, the man who gave them the orders was gone and he was unavailable. It concluded with the British authorities executing the Australians, and that did happen. They were the scapegoats, I guess is the word for it. And the other thing was the British authorities at that time were trying to show the Boers that they were not going to be the beasts that they had been with their policies up until that time. So they executed a few of their soldiers. Conclusions. The Boers were defeated and they were erased from history. They were just a small blip in the books. Far more Boer civilians died than Boer combatants. In this whole war, there were less than 10,000 Boer military casualties, but there were many thousand civilians who died just in the concentration camp. But it had significant omens. The era of empires was over. They were on their last legs. The British Empire lasted for another 40 years, but it was dying and didn't know it. The big learning was a determined minority of guerrillas is hard to defeat. And I put the parenthesis there, even when they had no external support. Nobody was supporting the Boers except people were selling them weapons, but they'd sell weapons to anybody. Unlike our experience in Vietnam, where the North Vietnamese had two different large countries supporting them. The other thing is that self-righteous arrogance leads to atrocities. The concentration camps, the scorched earth. Does that sound familiar to you? Ours were not quite as brutal as that, but we forced people into strategic hamlets. We bombed the hell out of Vietnam in order to save it from itself. We scorched the earth in Vietnam. History could teach us much, but it doesn't seem to do so. And with that, I'll take questions if you got any.
Yeah, George, I would like to know what relationship did Cecil Rhodes have with the De Beer family? Because you're talking gold versus diamonds.
Rhodes was about diamonds.
Yeah.
I don't know what his involvement was with gold. He was going to try to get into the gold business when he went to Rhodesia, but he bought the De Beers family diamond mines at the beginning. The De Beer Corporation, or whatever you want to call it, that was his corporation, and he bought it from the De Beer family. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
George, you know what the population was of those areas?
Relatively small, Jerry, in the few 100,000.
Yeah.
They were not big.
And what about native people? Were there very many, native Africans?
No, they were tribal. They fought among themselves. They fought with the Boers. They fought with the British, and they were pretty severely limited in terms of their growth by all of the fighting that they did.
Like the American Indian.
Like the American Indian. There you go.
Yeah.
That's a good example. But speaking of the American Indian, where do you think we learned how to put them on reservations?
Yeah. And then how long did that Dominion last?
Which Dominion?
The Dominion of South Africa.
Oh,
Yeah,
how long was, I think it lasted until
After the World War II?
yeah, I was gonna say in the mid 60s.
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe even a little bit later than that.
George, it's Paul. What do you have any idea what the long rifle, what weapons they're actually using, like in the photograph there? Were those just bolt action, or were they automatic, or what were they?
No, they were bolt action Krug rifles.
Yeah.
George,
German.
they didn't have any Gatling guns there, did they?
The British had Maxim guns, which were even better than Gatling guns.
Yeah, those are machine gun, yeah.
But
Water.
the Boers, I don't think had any. If they did, they didn't have very many. They were mostly individual fighters, and they fought as guerrillas. They did not, at the very beginning of the Boer War, they actually were structured into units. When the British attacked them and coming into the Orange Free State, at first they beat the British in open combat, but then they were overwhelmed. And that's when they broke up and started fighting as individual guerrilla units, commando units.
Okay, good program, George. I enjoyed
Good,
that.
George.
George.
Thank you, George.
Guys.
I commend you on pronouncing all those odd names with
Thank you.
30 vowels in them.
Hey, George.
What?
Yeah, this is Bill. Just as a footnote, General Baden-Powell was in charge of the garrison at Mafeking that was under siege, and that almost a year they were surrounded by several thousand Boers, but they couldn't take over the garrison because the Boers were always woefully lacking in heavy weapons, artillery, that kind of thing. That's one of the things that they had small arms and long guns, but they didn't have heavy artillery or many machine guns. So it really affected their ability to fight war. And of course, Baden-Powell came back, and he founded the Boy Scouts, as maybe some of you would know. And he did that as a result of a lot of the lessons he learned in Africa about his thing was scouting, forward scouting and, looking for the enemy and that kind of thing. And he used that skill to transfer to young boys as a young training ground for British soldiers when he first came back.
Interesting.
So, yeah, that was his, I guess, contribution or participation in the fighting in the Second Boer War.
Did not know that. Thank you, Bill.
So,
Yeah.
Bill, did they form the Scouts as a paramilitary?
No. Oh,
unit?
no.
Had no connection with military then.
No, it was only to teach them skills with a nudge towards using that to go into the British military. And a lot of it was used. And frankly, a lot of it map reading and that kind of thing, camping and so forth is a skill that soldiers used all on, because the British Army didn't have those kind of skills that were needed to be employed in Africa during the Boer War.
That's correct. Thank you, Bill.